December 1942. Somewhere on the Eastern Front, Russia. Before dawn. The temperature had fallen below minus 20 degrees Celsius before the first pale ghost of morning light touched the frozen steppe. A German soldier in winter gear, his greatcoat frosted at the collar, his fingers wrapped in cloth rags where proper gloves had long since worn away, crouched over a small metal field cup. He was not sleeping. He had not slept properly in days. The wind moved across the Russian plain with the indifference of a thing that had never known warmth and did not miss it. Around him, the camp stirred slowly, the way men stir when the body moves from something other than will, from training, from fear, from the mechanical necessity of staying alive one more hour inside a war that had begun to consume its own makers. He held the cup with both hands and brought it to his lips. He drank. It tasted of burnt grain and chicory root. It tasted of nothing that had ever grown beneath a tropical sun. It was not coffee. It had never been coffee. But it was hot, and for a moment the heat of it moved down through him like a small, dishonest promise. The promise that somewhere behind him, the world he had been told was superior, still existed, still held, still justified everything that had brought him to this frozen place with a rifle and a cup of ersatz warmth. He did not know it yet. None of them did. But the cup he held, that dark, bitter, fabricated drink, was not merely a substitute for a beverage. It was a symbol of everything the Third Reich had told its people about itself. That imitation was strength, that sacrifice was abundance, that what was false could, with enough conviction and enough authority, be made to feel real. The reckoning was already moving toward him across the Atlantic. To understand what that cup of false coffee meant, it is necessary to go back, not just years, but generations. Germany had a long and intimate relationship with coffee substitutes, and that relationship was not born of choice. It was born of isolation. As far back as the continental blockade of the early 19th century, when Napoleonic France cut off much of Europe from colonial imports, German households had been forced to find replacements for the real coffee bean. The solution, born of scarcity and necessity, was a beverage brewed from roasted chicory root, barley, rye, acorns, beet, and malt, a concoction that darkened water and held a bitter edge, but contained no coffee whatsoever. The Germans called it Ersatzkaffee. In the Rhine dialect, it acquired another name, Muckafuck, a corruption of the French phrase macafo, meaning false coffee. The name acknowledged the lie even as it accepted it. By the time of the First World War, ersatz had become something of a German national philosophy. When British naval blockades choked off the flow of imports into Germany, an entire economy of substitutes emerged. Paper fiber replaced canvas. Turnip sugar replaced cane sugar. Roasted plum leaves stood in for tea. And muckafuck, that old and familiar deceit, returned to the German table as if it had never truly left. Officials of the imperial government publicly declared that these substitutes were the equal of the originals, that a nation capable of inventing its own materials needed nothing from the outside world. The propaganda of sufficiency became, over decades, a kind of cultural reflex. And so, when the Third Reich came to power in 1933 and began its program of economic self-sufficiency, what the Nazis called autarky, the psychology was already in place. By 1939, Germany had achieved near total domestic production of sugar, grain, and many core foodstuffs. But coffee, real coffee, Kaffeebohnen from Brazil, from Colombia, from Java, coffee could not be grown in Europe. It could not be synthesized from German soil. And when the Allied naval blockade of Germany tightened its grip across the war years, real coffee vanished from the Reich almost entirely. What replaced it was something the Nazi regime could not quite bring itself to name honestly. The ersatz products were packaged with German thoroughness, sold with German conviction, and consumed by German soldiers and civilians who had, by this point, been trained to accept the substitution without complaint. To complain was to suggest that Germany lacked something, and Germany, the Reich insisted, lacked nothing. On the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942, the lie was becoming difficult to sustain. German supply lines, stretched across thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory, were failing. The Wehrmacht had driven deep into Russia with the confidence of a force that had conquered most of Europe in under 3 years. But Russia was not France. Russia was distant and cold, and an enemy that did not stop. By the autumn of 1942, German rations on the front lines had been reduced from their already modest field allocations. Bread was scarce, meat was scarcer, and in the field kitchens, those mobile hearths that the German army relied upon with far greater organizational dependency than their American or British counterparts, the coffee was, and had always been, muckafuck. Roasted grain, chicory root, brown water with a bitter memory of something it had never been. German soldiers who wrote home during this period, and hundreds of thousands of letters survive in archives, made quiet, sardonic references to their morning drink. One soldier wrote of his field cup with a mixture of humor and resignation, noting that the coffee issued to them would not have fooled a child's palate. The humor was the defense mechanism of men who had been told, repeatedly, that they were the inheritors of a superior civilization, and who were beginning to notice, in small and daily ways, the gap between that claim and their experience. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in a country the Nazi propaganda machine had spent years describing as racially degenerate, culturally chaotic, and militarily impotent, something very different was happening inside the American soldier's tin cup. The United States Army had, by 1942, designated coffee not as a luxury, but as a military essential. The War Department had drawn this conclusion based on both physiological and psychological evidence. Coffee increased alertness on the battlefield, raised morale in the field, and, in the words of military medical assessments of the era, could be used to help prevent the onset of shock in wounded soldiers. It was, in the clinical language of the American military, a weapon of sustenance. The numbers behind this designation were extraordinary. American soldiers consumed an average of 32.5 pounds of coffee per man per year. By comparison, the entire coffee supply available to the German civilian population had shrunk to near zero by 1942. The U.S. Army purchased approximately 140,000 bags of coffee every single month to keep pace with military demand. Between 1941 and 1942, the Army's total coffee requisition increased by a factor of 10. Companies like Maxwell House, operating under contracts with the General Foods Corporation, retooled their production specifically for military-grade instant coffee, a granulated soluble powder that could be dissolved in field water and consumed in the mud of a foxhole, in the rain of a jungle, in the cold of a mountain campaign, with the same reliable result every time. Each K-ration breakfast issued to an American soldier contained 5 grams of soluble coffee, a modest portion by civilian standards perhaps, but one that represented a daily ritual of continuity. The American soldier's morning was anchored by something real, something sourced from the living tropics of Central and South America, something that tasted like the country he had left behind. It was not merely nutrition. It was a sensory link to home, to normalcy, to a society that produced enough of everything that even its fighting men, even in the farthest corners of the war, could begin their day with a genuine cup of coffee. American soldiers had a name for it. They called it a cup of joe, a term whose democratic roots ran deep, traceable in part to an order by Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels in 1914, who had banned alcohol from naval vessels, leaving coffee as the common drink of every rank and rating, from admiral to seaman. Coffee, in American military culture, was the great equalizer. It carried no rank. It asked for no privilege. The officer and the private drank from the same essential supply. The encounter between German soldiers and American coffee, the moment the laugh became silence, came not slowly, but all at once, and it came in North Africa. By the spring of 1943, the Afrika Korps, that legendary formation of German and Italian troops under Erwin Rommel's Desert Command, had been broken. The American forces, initially mauled at the Kasserine Pass in February, had recovered, reorganized, and pressed the Axis into a final, shrinking perimeter on the Tunisian coast. On May 13, 1943, the last organized Axis resistance in North Africa collapsed. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, among them some of the most battle-hardened veterans of the German Wehrmacht. These men had been told many things about America. They had been told it was a country of racial contradictions, too divided to fight as one, too soft in its prosperity to endure the hardship of real war. They had been told American industry was impressive but brittle, that American soldiers were inexperienced and unmotivated. They had been told, with the full weight of a propaganda apparatus that controlled every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every official statement in the Reich, that the United States represented a declining civilization. The first German prisoners crossed the Atlantic and arrived at American POW camps in the summer of 1943. The first contingent entered Camp Concordia in Kansas on July 4, 1943, a date whose irony was apparently lost on no one observing it. They had eaten almost nothing on the transit. Their digestive systems were those of men who had lived for months on reduced rations, ersatz food, and whatever the North African desert could offer. The camp medical log from Concordia records 43 separate incidents in the first week alone. Cases of soldiers suffering acute digestive distress, not from deprivation, but from the sudden reintroduction of fat, protein, and nutritional richness after months of near starvation. Their bodies had forgotten what real food felt like. But it was coffee that many of them would later remember as the first, most disorienting moment. A cup was placed before them. Real coffee. Freshly brewed, American issue, produced in quantities that the American military had never once thought to present as a privilege or an achievement, because it was neither. It was simply breakfast. It was simply what soldiers drank. No ceremony attended its serving. No announcement was made. A cup was placed before them with the casual indifference of abundance. They drank. They did not laugh. Academic historian Arnold Kramer, in his exhaustive study of German prisoners of war in the United States, documented the psychological impact of American abundance on German POWs with remarkable precision. Prisoners who arrived expecting a broken, struggling nation encountered instead a country where the mess halls were stocked with quantities of food that exceeded what they had received as Wehrmacht frontline soldiers. The coffee was real. The meat was real. The bread was not made from sawdust or rye extender. Chocolate appeared in their rations. Fruit arrived. One German officer, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months into his American captivity and struggled to describe the reality he had encountered. A country whose ordinary, daily functioning contradicted every claim his government had ever made about it. The re-education program that the U.S. Army eventually formalized kept deliberately quiet at the time, as it likely ran against the spirit of the Geneva Convention's prohibition on exposing prisoners to propaganda, did not need to work particularly hard to change minds. The environment itself was the argument. German prisoners who labored on American farms during harvest season encountered something no pamphlet could have communicated: the scale of American agricultural production. Wheat fields that stretched beyond the horizon. Orchards that produced more fruit in a single grove than a German town might see in a year. And every morning, in the camp mess hall, that same cup of coffee, unchanged, unapologetic, real. The American propagandists understood, instinctively, what the Nazis had never quite grasped: that ideology is fragile when confronted by material reality. A man can be told for years that his civilization is superior. He can believe it with conviction. But place before him a cup of genuine coffee, when he has spent the last 2 years drinking roasted chicory and ground acorns, and something cracks. Not loudly, not all at once. But it cracks. The laugh, when it had come easily. German soldiers and officers throughout the war had found American culture a convenient target for condescension. The food, the music, the manners, all of it was held up as evidence of a culture too young, too mixed, too commercial to produce anything of lasting value. The Americans, they were told, were a consumer people without depth. They had no philosophy. They had no history worth naming. All they had was things, an embarrassing, undignified abundance of things. They had not understood, until they sat inside American plenty, That things, that abundance, that capacity to produce and distribute beyond immediate need were not the symptom of a shallow civilization. They were the product of one that had learned to trust its own people. A nation that feeds its soldiers real coffee does not do so by accident. It does so because it has built over generations a system of production, of supply, of logistics, a system that reflects a fundamental decision about what soldiers are worth and what the country owes them. The ersatz cup of muckafuck, by contrast, reflected a different decision, that the soldier was an instrument, that his comfort was expendable, that what mattered was not his humanity, but his utility. Germany had dressed its substitutes up as equivalents. America had never bothered pretending its coffee was anything other than what it was: real, sourced, abundant, democratic. By the war's end, approximately 371,000 German prisoners of war had passed through American camps. Many of them gained significant weight. Some accounts record gains of 50 pounds or more over the course of internment. They were, under the Geneva Convention, fed according to the same standard as American enlisted soldiers. The American government did not reduce their rations. It did not feed them ersatz. It fed them what it fed its own men. The German military had, at its height, maintained a formal field ration of approximately 4,500 calories per day for frontline soldiers, a scientifically designed allocation that, on paper, was among the most generous of any army in the war. But by 1943, that paper ration existed increasingly in the realm of administration and decreasingly in the realm of reality. Supply chains broke down. Logistics failed. The Eastern Front consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. The field kitchens that had once been the Wehrmacht's proud system of hot daily meals became, in many sectors, a memory. Soldiers ate what they could find, cooked what they could carry, and drank every morning their muckafuck, their false coffee, their substitute for normalcy, their daily reminder that what the Reich had promised and what the Reich could deliver had come apart. The contrast was not lost on the men who experienced it. Letters from German POWs in American camps, preserved in archives and cited by researchers including Kramer, return again and again to the theme of bewilderment. Not anger, not pride, but genuine, destabilizing bewilderment at the gap between what they had been told and what they had found. One refrain recurs across many accounts: they had expected to find a people in decline. They found instead a people who appeared not to notice that there was a war on. Not because Americans were indifferent to the war. American families had sent their sons to it, their husbands, their fathers, but because the war had not yet reached the American grain fields, had not yet emptied the American coffee warehouses, had not yet forced the American housewife to roast chicory root over a wood fire and tell her children it was the same as the real thing. It was not the same as the real thing. It had never been the same as the real thing. July 4th, 1943. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The summer heat of the Kansas plain pressed down on the long wooden buildings of the camp as the first German prisoners settled at their assigned tables in the mess hall. Outside, the flat American earth stretched in every direction, still, enormous, indifferent to their presence. There was a smell in the room that many of them had not encountered in months, perhaps longer. Not the smell of grain powder and chicory, not the ersatz memory of something absent, the smell of genuine roasted coffee, brewing. It arrived in cups before them, served without ceremony, without comment, without any invitation to marvel. It was simply what was served. Outside the windows of Camp Concordia, the American heartland sat in its summer abundance, unoccupied, unruined, producing at a rate that no blockade had touched and no bomber had reached. Inside, in the mess hall of a prisoner of war camp, on the 4th of July, on the day America marked its founding decision to declare itself free, German soldiers encountered, perhaps for the first time without the filter of propaganda, the most honest statement the United States had ever made about itself. Not in a speech, not in a pamphlet, not in a broadcast, in a cup of coffee. There is a temptation, in retrospect, to treat this moment as a small thing, a detail of dietary history, a footnote in a vast and violent record. But the cup of coffee was not a small thing. It was a measure. It measured the distance between what a nation promises its people and what it is actually capable of delivering. It measured the gap between ideology and material truth. It measured what it costs in industrial organization, in agricultural infrastructure, in political will, in the fundamental decision to treat the ordinary soldier as a human being whose comfort matters, to place a genuine cup of roasted coffee before every fighting man every morning, without exception, regardless of where in the world that man is fighting. Germany had spent years building the myth of its own sufficiency. It had perfected the art of the substitute, ersatz food, ersatz values, ersatz community, ersatz truth, and had packaged every substitution as an achievement of German ingenuity rather than an admission of German limitation. The cup of Muckefuck was the daily sacrament of that myth. It was drunk without irony by men who did not know they were drinking the ideology of a state that had confused scarcity with discipline and propaganda with reality. America had made a different choice, or rather, America had been shaped over generations by a different set of choices, rooted not in the commands of a central authority, but in the accumulated decisions of millions of ordinary people who grew things, traded things, built things, and then consumed those things without being asked to pretend they were something other than what they were. American coffee was not a propaganda achievement. It was simply what happened when a country organized itself around the premise that its people's ordinary needs were worth meeting. The German soldier on the Eastern Front who raised his field cup to his lips in December of 1942 was not a fool. He was a man inside a system that had told him a lie so comprehensive, so structurally embedded in the daily texture of his life, that the lie had become indistinguishable from the truth. He drank his ersatz warmth, and he believed, or tried to believe, that it was enough, that he had enough, that Germany had enough. But the truth, the real thing, dark and honest and sourced from the living earth of a continent Germany would never conquer, was already waiting for him on the other side of the Atlantic, waiting in a tin cup, waiting without judgment, waiting with the quiet, patient, absolute certainty of something that does not need to pretend. A cup of coffee, after all, cannot lie. It either is or it is not. It either carries the weight of a real harvest, the labor of real hands, the wealth of real soil, or it carries only the memory of those things, roasted out of substitutes by a civilization that has run out of the real. In the end, that is what separated the two armies in their morning ritual. Not courage, not ideology, not the particular claims of one civilization over another. What separated them was simpler and more devastating than any of those things. One soldier held the real thing, the other held the memory of it. And a man who has drunk the real thing, even once, in a mess hall in Kansas on a 4th of July, at the end of a long crossing from a war he had believed in, can no longer tell himself that the substitute is sufficient. He can no longer perform that particular act of loyalty to a lie. The taste will not permit it. The warmth will not permit it. The simple, irrefutable reality of genuine abundance, placed before him without ceremony, without triumph, without a single word of comparison, that will not permit it. The war was won, in many places, by many means. In the factories of Detroit, in the wheat fields of Kansas, in the shipyards of Baltimore, in the blood of the Pacific atolls and the bocage of Normandy. But it was also won, quietly and without fanfare, in the morning, in the particular truth of what each soldier raised to his lips when the darkness of the night lifted and the next day of the world began. The Americans called it a cup of joe. Just coffee. Just ordinary. Just enough. The rest, as any honest man who has tasted both will tell you, was never really a contest.